being here today. I'm going to keep the unmonitored talks going back to Lake Champlain and looking at diet comparison between the stocked and naturally produced or wild lake trout in that system. Quick thanks to Jacques Richard and Ellen Marsden who helped me out a lot with this project. And yeah, let's get into it. So, also a lot of other folks today. This is part of my dissertation, and catching fish for diet analyses requires a lot of fish, which requires a lot of people, especially when people like me are really bad at catching fish. So, got to do all sorts of different sampling methods, angling, gill nets, all different times of year to look for seasonal effects. A lot of folks helped out with that. Had a lot of help from Department of Fish and Wildlife. A lot of the fish were captured with assistance from one of the charter groups out in Lake Champlain. So they were a big help. And then funding for the project came from Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. So, think a little bit more about basic fish biology. We know that foraging behaviors in fish can largely be influenced by their rearing environment. And this is because they can learn behaviors that are dependent on that food availability. So fish reared on artificial diets and hatchery settings can have behaviors suited for those environments. So this might be like kind of this lazy foraging where fish are only going to feed when the food is provided to them. They're going to target where that food accumulates. So that might be something like on the bottom of those tanks in slow-moving waters. And then you can also see low foraging success once these fish are put into natural systems. So fewer natural prey consumed and a greater frequency of empty stomachs. Foraging success can also determine the species that you're targeting, so your diet diversity. So there's all these different things that are part of fish foraging. So you start foraging, you encounter the individual, you detect it, all the way down to actual consumption of that organism. So there's a lot of factors in play there. And if you have low success from anywhere in this process, you might have a more generalistic foraging behavior. So you're not going to be as selective. You're going to kind of feed on whatever's right in front of you. Whereas if you have a lot of success, you're good at foraging, you can be more selective for those prey that are going to give you the most kind of bang for your buck. So targeting those energetically rich prey. Now looking at Lake Champlain, if you're here for Graham's talk, he was talking about the history of Atlantic salmon. The history for lake trout is very similar. They were extirpated by the 1900s, and so stocking started in the 1970s. The one difference from Graham's talk is that we actually now have natural recruitment of lake trout. So after 40 plus years of this annual stocking, we see these wild deer classes. We can distinguish the wild fish from the stock fish because just about all stock fish have this fin clip, a hatchery mark. I say just about, it's about a 2% error rate, so about 2% of the stock fish won't have that missing fin clip, but we're seeing much higher percentages of unclipped fish indicating that there's a lot of natural recruitment going on in the lake. And now we've got over 10 years of these wild deer classes. And this has led to a big pulse in the percentage of wild fish showing up as adults in the system. So we've got over 20% of the fish captured in recent summer surveys as adults are these wild fish. So here's just a couple year classes at the juvenile stage. But it's been really great to see this success story playing out. Stocked and wild fish have been coexisting for over a decade now, so there have been a lot of studies, or some studies looking at comparisons of those two populations. And as juveniles, we see that there are differences in their diets. So the stockfish are less effective foragers than the wild fish. So we see things like greater frequency of empty stomachs. Stocked is going to be in green, wild is going to be in purple kind of presentation. And you can just see the higher bars, more frequent empty stomachs in these stockfish compared to wild fish, again, as juveniles. We also saw that they have lower prey consumption. Now we're looking at lipid content here. So the higher the lipid content, the better off you are. And we see that kind of across seasons. When stockfish are first put in, they got really high lipids. That's a result from them being in the hatchery. They're just gorging them with food. But shortly after they get to the system, that lipid content just drops down. Wild fish is going up. So we see that change in the kind of the success of the foraging based on those energy reserves. And we also see that there's a slower growth rate for those stockfish compared to the wild ones. Again, all as juveniles. So now I wanted to look at this across life stages. Like I said, lake trout have been in the system for multiple years now at the wild stage. So we get to see these fish maturing, and we can compare them across these life stages. So across life stages, now including juveniles and adults, having the prediction that, again, lake trout as stocked individuals will have lower energy consumption, also having more diverse diets. That comes back to that generalist versus specialist. if they're not able to forage as successfully, they're going to have to be less selective. And we're looking at the main offshore prey fish that these lake trout are going to be encountering: alewife, smelt, trout perch, yellow perch, and slimy sculpion, and give an idea of where we're catching these fish all along the Vermont side of the main lake in Lake Champlain. We used a bunch of different analyses to compare foraging success. Most typical one, just stomach dissections, looking at what's actually in the stomachs. So, presence, absence, was there stuff in the stomachs or not? Reconstructed massive prey. So this is something where, down to just like individual bones, we would recalculate the size of that fish when it was consumed, and then we get an estimated weight for that fish. So we can do an overall estimate of the total mass of the diet items that were consumed. That way we can account for differences in like digestion rates, just to figure out what was the mass of these individuals when they were consumed. And then also diet diversity. We also included lipid content and fatty acid analyses to give us more long-term estimates of what diet patterns look like in these fish. So if you're not familiar with diet analysis or with fatty acid analyses, we process about 30 fatty acids per individual, and that's what each one of these peaks represent, is the concentration of an individual fatty acid, and that kind of creates a barcode for this individual fish. And fatty acids are transferred from prey to predator conservatively. So if you have alewife with a unique barcode, rainbow smelt with a unique barcode, if the lake trout has a barcode that's more closely related to the alewife one, you're feeding on more alewife. So we can look at diet overlap based on the origin of the lake trout, stocked wild, their size, and then also different times of the year. Going into the number of fish that were collected, we got hundreds of lake trout that we used for stomach content analysis. This is just a distribution of the sample collection based on size and time of year. So we used both gill nets and angling, and all fish were captured between April and December, trying to get that distribution of the different seasons. Most fish were over 400 millimeters, so you'll see, especially for the wild fish, this is just, there's 4 fish all from one season. But we still had relatively good representation across a bunch of different sizes here. And lake trout mature at about 500 millimeters. For the lipid and fatty acid analysis, we had about 100 of each stocked and wild fish. Similar comparisons here, you'll notice there's no follow. And then as far as the prey fish, to get those signatures to compare with the lake trout, we got about 50 fish of each of those prey fish to get their signatures for those comparisons. And also looked at the lipid content to have an idea of which of these prey fish would be that kind of optimal prey for the lake trout if they were going to be selective. Diving into the results now, starting off with the empty stomachs. So we see that stocked fish have, again, largely at the juvenile stage, and then a little bit at the adult stage, greater frequency of empty stomachs. On average, with model estimates, is about 19% higher for the stocked fish compared to wild fish across both the juveniles and adults. One thing that's not too surprising here with adults, there's this huge jump in the number of empty stomachs during fall, because that's when the lake trout are spawning, they're not going to be feeding. We did see that the stockfish also consumed fewer prey, so they had fewer prey numbers within their stomachs, and this is prey fish. And so just showing that on the graph here, again, that pattern shown kind of across sizes. The reconstructed mass was also lower for stocked fish, and lipid content was lower across fish, again, across sizes. And then the last one that I found to be pretty interesting was these are all artificial fishing lures, rubber lures that we love to use. They weren't too common, they were low percentages, but I mean that's a big increase for the stocked fish compared to wild fish. There's only one wild fish that had any artificial lures, and there are a number of stocked ones. Still a small percent of the population, but you know that's when you have a stomach that looks like that with lures, that's going to have a big effect on that fish. So of all these analyses, the 2 with the stars there were the only significant differences. So fewer fish consumed and also that decrease in lipid content. But when we're looking at the reconstructed mass as well as the number of prey fish, we excluded the empty stomachs. And if you include both the empty stomachs and the mass, that becomes significant as well. So when you incorporate everything together, you know, these metrics suggest that, you know, altogether, the stocked fish are really having lower foraging success based on the mass of things that they're eating, the number of fish that they're consuming, frequency of stomachs, and then also that lipid content being kind of a more long-term evaluation of that foraging success. You know, how much energy, what's the condition of these lake trout? So really some reassuring results that everything's showing the same pattern. Stockfish aren't feeding as successfully as the wild ones across life stages. Looking at the prey selectivity, alewife, as probably a lot of us know, are kind of the targeted prey for a lot of salmonids out there, and that's what we're seeing in Lake Champlain with these lake trout. Across all sizes, alewife typically make up most of the prey. On average, it's about 75% of fish primarily consumed, or alewife account for over 75% of the prey consumed among all lake trout. Other fish, rainbow smelt were pretty important. Some sizes, trout perch actually did show up in some smaller wild fish, and sculpin were showing up a little bit. Looking at the lipid content of kind of the most important prey being or most abundant prey in the stomachs, alewife, smelt, sculpin, and trout perch. Alewife and trout perch actually had, it was surprising to see trout perch had so much lipid content, but alewife, we've seen this in other systems as well. They have really high lipid content compared to those other prey. It makes sense why those would be the targeted prey for these predators. And we also see that there's a size selection, or an ontogenetic shift in diets, where the larger these fish get, the more selective they get for alewife. Alewife have a deep body, so there can be some gait limitation with the smaller individuals, but it also might be something with learning, where these adult fish are, they have more experience capturing alewife, and they might become more successful there. But we also see, so now what we have here is the size of lake trout on the x-axis and percent of alewife in the diet. So the points that are higher, you're feeding on a lot more alewife. And this is again showing that kind of ontogenetic shift, where as fish get larger, they feed on more alewife. But that slope is steeper for the wild fish than it is for the stockfish. So it suggests that the wild fish are able to be selective for those alewife earlier in their life. So they're kind of learning that behavior, they're having that selectivity earlier on. Next, jumping into the fatty acid analyses, like I said, we had to figure out what the signatures were for the prey were, so that way we could see what the differences in the predators are. And there were two or three fatty acids that were really driving these differences. Oleic acid here was pulling off to the top left here, and we have alewife. So alewife are really rich in that oleic acid. Smelt over here pulling off to the right with DHA. And those two species being the primary species that the lake trout are foraging on, I'm just going to focus on those two fatty acids. So you can imagine that if you have a lake trout that's high in oleic acid, primarily feeding on alewife, whereas if it's high in DHA, primarily feeding on those fatty acids. Overall comparison of stocked and wild fish, really not seeing a whole lot of differences here. But when you break things down by the size of the lake trout, again, you can see this really nice ontogenetic shift, where you go from a diet that has more DHA to a diet that's going to be more rich in oleic acid. So that shift again, seeing it where early on in life they have more diverse diet, alewife and smelt. As they get larger, go more towards that alewife diet. And now looking at the seasonal component of stomach contents, seeing if there's any differences in what the fish are feeding on across winter, spring, summer, and fall. We see that there's the most diet diversity during winter, where rainbow smelt and sculpin are a lot more common. That makes sense because during that time of year, fish kind of just scatter throughout the lake, right? It's isothermal, everything's cold, the lake trout can go everywhere, the prey kind of go everywhere, so the interactions between the predator and prey are going to be a lot less common than, say, during the summer when you have stratification that causes everything to be forced into the same area. So what we see here now, though, is the lake trout that are wild still have a greater proportion of alewife in their diet, and that again suggests like they have this greater selectivity. So again, we're seeing the wild fish being more optimal foragers. They're able to be more selective in their diet. A few samples were collected during fall. Like I mentioned before, there really weren't a lot of lake trout that we collected during that season that had stuff in their stomachs because they're not foraging at that time. And again, the contribution of alewife was lower for the stocked fish than it was for the wild fish, especially in winter at the adult stage. Kind of weird result there with the juveniles. So this is looking at Schoner's index, so you can think of this as percent overlap. Values greater than 60% suggest that there's really high overlap. So you have, for a lot of these, it's high overlap because alewife do make up most of the diet. But low sample size here, so how much do we really trust those results? But at the adult stage, again, lowest overlap during the winter season. Stocked fish have more diverse diets, wild fish really keeping to that alewife diet. So thinking about all these results together, we see that the stocked lake trout are really often feeding less and less than the wild fish. So we see fewer prey fish in their stomachs, greater frequency of empty stomachs, and less selectivity for the alewife. And that's a lot to think about with a lot of these populations, lake trout populations, where we're trying to restore lake trout, and a lot of efforts haven't really been able to take off. So wondering if this lack of foraging success might be a result of that. And there's actually a paper that came out in Lake Champlain recently where lake trout recruitment didn't take off until alewife were introduced to the lake. So wondering if that kind of boost in energy supply that the alewife provide allowed that population to recover. So just thinking about what this means for the lake dynamics. The wild lake trout might have greater predatory pressure on the forage base, which is a really important component, right? Because if we're thinking about restoration of these species, it's going to be like a one-to-one comparison, right? Where you think a stockfish that gets replaced by a wild fish might be the same, not necessarily the case. Alewife are providing more energy for the stockfish compared. Okay, so it's the alewife are providing more energy. So that's like what I was saying about before, where we're seeing that the lake trout are now that the stockfish are able to take off with the wild population, producing more offspring that are surviving. But increased alewife consumption can lead to thymic deficiency complex. So wondering, what does this mean for the stock population, or the new wild population? If they're consuming more alewife, are they going to be at a greater risk of that thymic deficiency? And that's just something that we have to look into, where you have, this is a healthy population, efficient population, you have 100% mortality of those offspring. What does that mean for the restoration of this population? So that's all I got. If you have any questions that you aren't able to ask right now, feel free to send me an email. But I think I hopefully have at least a couple minutes for questions. And again, thanks for sitting in.